Hello, everyone, and possibly even every more than one. Welcome to My Kind of Country, an integral stage series exploring nationhood, politics, and the civic spirit. What is national intersubjectivity? How do we personally experience and collectively create a shared sacred sensibility that exceeds our differences? What are the actual boundaries of these sensibilities? How are they instantiated in our lifetime of political engagements and political conclusions, both within and between countries? More specifically, how is all of that experienced through the living lens of people in developmental, transformational, and regenerative spaces of liminal, integrative, and metaculture? Here to help us explore the cultural field of the Mesoamerican nation of El Salvador, or at least the ways in which it appears to and intersects with her own unfolding relationship to the American spirit, is the maven of uncertainment, Lisa Norton. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Layman. Great to be here.
Okay,
Thanks for
I don't
that.
expect you to be a trained political scientist specializing in El Salvador any more than I expect you to be able to necessarily speak to the indigenous spirit of native-born El Salvadorans. But what I do want to do is follow the story of your history of engagements with nationhood up to and including your transition to El Salvador and your appreciations therein. But I think the place to start is, are you proud to be an American? What's your relationship to the American spirit?
Yeah, no. Right now, I am decidedly not proud to be an American. I think that's more of a lifelong thread. You know, I was born a year and a half before JFK was assassinated, and then, you know, Malcolm X, MLK, etc. That moment where I think the affairs, the international activities of the United States was really, coming to the surface in a new kind of way. So I was very imprinted by that. Of course, I don't remember any of that, but I was imprinted by my family system, my lower working class democratic family horror at the death of Camelot, even though we know in hindsight that it wasn't quite so simple as all that. But yeah, so I think I heard Brad Kirshner speaking with you, and I've always had that shame of the American abroad, and I've traveled all my life, um, probably because of that, wondering whether others had figured it out, because I was so certain that we hadn't. So I think it's an interesting thing to be born in the center at at this moment. Does that kind of answer your question? I think
That's a
I'm,
great answer, and it makes me really curious about this. I heard Arnold Schwarzenegger say this interesting thing one time. Growing up in Austria just after the Second World War, he said he had this feeling that we had just tried to do some big thing and it had failed, right? And then he felt this pressure on himself to try to be big to counteract that. But you had this in your household anyway, this sense that something had just happened that subtracted from or disturbed the American soul.
definitely. And I think that's so much what this moment is about, the, there's so much to say about the action, but one of the tragic things is that the MAGA administration is going to preside over the ultimate collapse, the ultimate finale of American hegemony as we transition into we know not what, but it's not becoming great again, and everyone knows that. So that's really fascinating, the way individually and collectively we can use our imprinting, even our trauma, very constructively. That's, I think, the medicine we need. actually.
From your position as someone from inside America looking at it from the outside, does it seem like this moment of possible or probable collapse of American hegemony, does that seem like it's dictated to America by the external factors and forces of the world, and the Trump phenomenon is a symptom of that? Or does it seem like there's always the possibility of a bad strategy where people try to build up nation spirit in a way that destroys it?
What I think about is like when you look at, and I'm so I can't really speak in any way authoritatively, of course, about Israel, Palestine, or Syria, for example, but the deep temporal path dependencies that are built into these relationships. And but yet we maintain this public conceit that the change of the regime is an antidote for something or somehow going to be, I guess the other thing I want to shift a little bit and just go back to something you asked about earlier. I have definitely experienced patriotism, and I know what that is. Although I've been very jaded by various presidential administrations over the years. I lived in China for quite a long time, and I have experienced Chinese pride and Salvadoran pride here in Central America. So I think we can vicariously participate with that spirit of nationalism, and it's crucial. Otherwise, we're just kicking the legs out up from underneath us from a developmental and evolutionary perspective. So yeah, I forgot to say that what is it? Voice, loyalty, or exit. I chose exit for a bunch of reasons that we could talk about, but I've been doing that exit all my life to take a witness position in various places around the world. China before the Olympics was when I was living there. It was a very interesting time. And here in El Salvador, it's a fascinating time. And they're controversial times, extremely, extraordinarily controversial. So maybe I'll
Yeah.
stop
I
there.
do want to zero in on the moment of exit and what that was like. But first, I want to touch on, experiencing patriotism or sort of shared national spirit. It's an interesting thing when we feel separated from it. And whose responsibility is that separation, right? Have we become irresponsibly cynical, or has it let us down, or failed to establish the connection? How do you see that kind of relationship between, the responsibility of those whose job it is to help create that culture spirit, but also our responsibility to engage with it, even if it's not all there for us?
Yeah, definitely it's a mutual relation there. I feel I feel grief in the United States. Um, it's the level of meanness and polarization is just, but I think what that does is it hollows out that story of or the possibility of what a functional nation can be, and the possibility of how powerful we truly are collectively. That's that higher ground that the left has always had. or always did have. I I admire Noam Chomsky for so many different reasons, but he's not only anti-party politics for its own sake, but I think he points out that problem. Um, it's something to do with, I'm feeling something to do with genuine participation. The spirit, not the letter of democracy is what I feel we've lost. Yeah, I think there are a lot of Americans who are capable of leadership and want to participate, and then there's a significant barriers to that participation. For me personally, I'm trying to redirect and rechannel how I can participate. I'll stop again and you can redirect me if you're.
Sure. You mentioned this dichotomy of, voice loyalty or exit, and you chose exit. Um, what precipitated that? What was that like to go through? How did it feel in that moment when you thought, "Oh, I've got to choose exit here"?
Yeah, I don't think it was a moment. I think it's my habit nature, and I've been exiting all my life. So I think that disposition, my attachment style, my insecure attachment style is, a lifelong thing that I've been negotiating with. Um, this more recent exit, yeah, I think it relates back to voice loyalty or choice. As a career educator, in the academy, the zooming out a little bit, for me, the deep background is the collapse of all modern institutions, but the collapse of the state is what seems to be in our faces at the moment. But the collapse of higher ed, has been going on throughout my whole career. So I had to navigate at many different junctures, voice, loyalty, or exit. There was a time when I thought I had, you could say it negatively as sunk costs, or you could say it positively as I was situationally advantaged to be in the system in order to hospice that system. But yeah, those decision points about to stay, to go, I think I'm right at this point in my life, am, I've recovered my health after an illness, and that kind of comes back to, I say it as sacred friction. There, there weren't enough ways, there weren't enough outlets for the kinds of things that I wanted to do, and I wasn't receiving the friction, the challenge that I needed in that current role in higher ed for a bunch of reasons that we could get into. So I had to just, I've been in a process of coming back to the very direct, simple encounter with vitality, my own vitality. The Here in El Salvador, it happens to be a very exciting place to be right now. That's very controversial. We can talk about it. But yeah, I'm thinking of Giorgio Agamben 911 and COVID were so impactful on my turn toward anarchism, uh, ish, lifestyles. But Agamben makes that distinction about form of life, and I think that's what I've been fixated on my whole life. It's what got me into design. It's it's the deep care to preserve the option to participate with life force that Agamben in particular was concerned about, with the state of exception and other examples of authoritarianism, whether it be right or left. So I've become very much more overtly involved with those kinds of questions. And so I've just mapped that onto health. First of all, because I had to help myself in order to be credible to speak to anything or anyone else. I'm shamanic, I think, only in the sense that I have to taste the medicine. It's because when we convert learning into a speech act, it's dangerous in so many different ways. So I'm very protective of I don't want to be too clever or too quick to protocolify what I'm learning. And that's kind of how I got into the Uncertainment Lounge. I'm in this extended experiment with suspending judgment. I don't know if I answered your question.
It did seem like it swayed there, but there were some
Yeah.
interesting territories that it swayed into. So here you are in El Salvador, in the Salvador, in the Savior. An interesting name. You're convalescing, you're changing the form of life, you're experiencing this through your personal journey of healing, but you also want to taste the medicine. And if we say that the spirit of a nation is something like medicine, what's the difference in taste, the different flavor between El Salvador and the United States? How would you characterize the moods of these two countries?
Yeah. Well, right off the top, yeah, that spirit of national pride and hope and patriotism, I stood in Grant Park the night that Obama was elected in a sea of human beings, that just, it, you know, it was the most incredible, you know, mass experience I've ever been part of. Yet here in El Salvador, it's quite real. It's quite embodied, I would say. And I talk to a lot of people, as you can imagine. Bukele is the president, Nayib Bukele, he's a Palestinian Salvadoran who comes from a very learned family. His father was a physicist, and he works with his brothers while he's in office. He's starting a second term. He was reelected by something like a 90 something percent approval rating. But okay, that's the surface level. Yeah, I think when I speak with the most marginalized people, the poorest of the poor, and there's a lot of real poverty here for sure, what I hear is support for the most part and that national spirit that our people are participating with, and impatience and when will it be our turn? So it's not an ignorant or blind, following of this administration. And then there's a healthy contingent of haters and, serious opponents that have really serious points and grievances, such as the way the state of exception was declared here in order to imprison over 70,000 people, many of whom did not receive due process, many of whom are, still awaiting that. I don't think I have the latest stats on that, but I think, as far as I know, at least 5,000 people have been released who were either unjustly imprisoned or their sentences have been reduced or they've been, somehow there's been more justice brought to their cases. Not saying that makes it right. I think what I'm watching for is to what degree Bukele has bucked all the Bretton Woods institutions. He's tweeting the IMF, cheekily tweeting the White House and the Congress all the time and paying down national debt in order to shift the position of El Salvador vis-a-vis the World Bank and so forth. So trying to carve out the space for nation state prototyping, very different from Singapore, but that's kind of the spirit. It's a tiny country. In theory, it's a good place for experiments like this. Um, the I would say the example I would give would be like being on a bus or in a cab. People just spontaneously are really sense that they're a part of this process of this historic moment. And you could debate, many things about why that is, but people are not naive. The average person here is not naive. They've had 8 violent conflicts in the last 200 years. So intergenerational trauma is a really big thing here. It is a nation that's healing. Yeah, I'll stop there and let you redirect me.
Yeah, I'm curious about, you've said a couple of things about President Bukele, that he's cheeky, that he comes from an educated family, that he's got a sort of an interesting ethnic background as a Palestinian Salvadoran. What are your impressions of him as a human being? What's your sense of Bukele the man?
He calls himself a philosopher king on X. He has spoken about being guided by prayer. He's very Platonic in orientation. I think I just heard, sorry, I'm digressing again. I was just going to say, I heard Curtis Yarvin speaking here about an oligarchy for times like this, times of collapse. Yeah, I believe he's a very good influence on this country at this particular moment in time. And I think I've had personal experience with his brother. And so based on that direct encounter of actually being in conversation with his brother and his wife, I think I can kind of peer into the family psychology and intention a little bit. Yeah, I think it's a very, this person, this family doesn't live in the presidential mansion. They're very private, modest, family oriented, very, conservative, blue, amber. Um, yeah, I think because, Salvador led the war, they were the murder capital of, Latin America for so long. He is providing really good medicine for this country. So I respect what he's doing. I particularly appreciate how he's relating to global, you know, the global structures of power. Um, the other thing I like about him so much that I've heard you talk about is he's funny. Like, he's just willing to play. He's willing to, be playful in leadership. And in a way, what else can you do in the wake of so much intergenerational harm? There's a certain wisdom in that. So, yeah, he sees himself as restoring order, and I think that is, what he's done. Has there been overreach? For sure? Um, will that have to be walked back? For sure, if he's to remain credible? Will the prison industrial complex here have to be reformed? For sure. That, in my opinion, he has to go there next in order to maintain his credibility, his leadership credibility. But I think what the average person here wants is educational reform.
Beyond two obviously necessary features facing a distraught nation, one being stability, structure, order, and the other being um, the securing of modern institutions, such as educational institutions. What do you think it will take El Salvador to begin to really heal from generations of violence?
Yeah. I think it's the same thing. The healing that is needed is the same thing that's needed anywhere. Um, for example, Bukele is trying to demonstrate his commitment to eradicating corruption, for example. I think when it comes to the healing dimension of it, individually or collectively, it's doing the shadow work, it's taking back, it's understanding how we are embodying the seed of that thing, that evil other that we want to demonize and dehumanize. It's that emotion in the human that that gets, accelerated by social media and outrage culture. But I think the moves are going to be the same to take back the projections, to hold the stories more loosely. Like, for example, the we saw in this election, I feel that the political parties have lost salience. They lost it, I think, a long time ago, but there's this reflexive zombie stories of what the parties are that keep, that's remain alive. So I think the best, you know, healing function, that's the best use of the idea of the political party right now, is as a foil for shadow work
Mm.
more than anything, because it's through our traumatic response that we keep propping up those narratives that are so destructive, and that transfer the pain to the next generation.
That's a really nice framing. I like that, that the main utility at present of the vestigial zombie role of the established political parties is as a foil for collective shadow work. That's interesting. Um, what do you hear from Salvadorans about Trump's reelection?
They love it. I think, in the sense of, that mainstream political, on that level of mainstream political information, where most people are taking the choice between, these two imperfect, so exquisitely imperfect choices at face value, just in that partisan way. They love it because they see, I think, for one thing, they see Trump aligned with Bukele. They have publicly, endorsed one another. I think just on a strict partisan basis. And also because of the legacy of dependency in Latin America, we're on the dollar here, where America goes, Salvador goes. So there's all these, economic and other dependencies tied up with that. Yeah. But yeah, kind of resoundingly, oh, thank God, kind of like, oh, big relief, big, strong guy, big, strong protector, you know. And that, yeah, so probably much less paradoxically than Trump would be held in the United States, where it's so mixed and such a huge portion of people voted Trump despite themselves.
There's for them, it's a very straightforward embrace of the larger than life paternal figure.
Restoration of order, more of that, please. Yeah. This kind of stories I hear are really tender, like, oh, my family and I can finally drive to see her mother after, 10 years of being unable to go through gangland territory and feeling just stories of, I personally know people that were, unfortunately were victims of, gang warfare, and the kind of like culture of extortion that happens with that, which of course all comes back to the United States. This is a global phenomenon, but it gets characterized as a national thing, a national problem.
Central America seems like a place where a lot of interesting experiments can be done, right? That the regions are small enough and the populations are volatile enough. They're not totally subsumed by the Americans or the Chinese. They've got this kind of liminal status. Costa Rica is riddled with intentional communities. Honduras has this Prospera thing that's trying to be like Singapore. Is that your sense of this area, that it's an area that's ready to roll the dice and try some things?
Yes, I do think it's becoming a hotbed for that. And I would add that the other incentive is just the history of, revolution, corruption. There's just this huge. So, for example, yeah, Ecuador right now is in such a mess. Argentina, Venezuela, there's these country, I would say these country, the situations there are more like early harbingers of what collapse starts to look like in late modernity. So they're motivated, these countries are even more motivated, that's one of the questions that I think haunts the United States right now. How bad does it have to get? How farcically, decrepit do things have to get before we can collectively act and respond? So yeah, I think for better or worse, a lot of these smaller Latin American countries are in a great. That's exactly what I've met some of the people that are in the innovation group in the Salvadoran government, the New Ideas platform. And yeah, they are. They're looking at like really cutting edge stuff and definitely looking to Prospera and Vitalia and some of these other, definitely like surveying the whole landscape of global experimentation, Taiwan, the Nordic countries, those are the kind of models they're looking at.
What's going on with Bukele and Bitcoin?
Yeah, so yeah, if people don't know, Bukele declared Bitcoin a viable, national currency of record alongside the US dollar. So yeah, there were a couple of, I would say, the conversation here and the conversation that a lot of activists, Bitcoin fundamentalists and staunch Bitcoin activists here are trying to gin up is to do with adoption and education. That has always been the case. There was the famous example of the Hope House, which was it was a grant. It was a project developed by this Christian missionary Mike Peterson, who's an American who received an anonymous grant to create a, blockchain Bitcoin educational campaign for youth primarily and the stipulation was that it was used to create circular economy and that the Bitcoin would stay in the community and that it would be about promoting, awareness and know-how and adoption. Ultimately, that grant was renewed a second time. So it's reasonably successful, but I think the truth of it is that for the most part, digital nomads and privileged foreigners are driving whatever adoption is going on here. It's, limited to the more affluent. Every citizen of El Salvador received something called a Chivo wallet with $25 worth of Bitcoin in it. I think how how that has been received, it definitely has been super uneven, and I think definitely not the level of grassroots adoption that they're still hoping for. But what is interesting is that I do think in contexts where there has been the education, families have completely shifted their circumstances, pulled themselves out of poverty very impressively. But without that context of education about the principles of, crypto in general, crypto principles, then the whole effort is really, lost. So I would say it's still a question mark how, how this is all going to play out.
There's different scales of mutual recognition that go on between people, right? You recognize your partner or you recognize your family, or you can relate to people as, oh, that's another human being, or you can relate on the basis of some kind of nation state identity. I've been intrigued in Canada to observe myself participating in that over the years. There's a sort of feeling where I was thinking, I see a guy working on his car and I give him a nod. And then we both just continue. But the nod says, we're citizen participants. And it's just this mutual recognition. It's not the same feeling I have if I meet somebody from Mozambique and recognize them as a human being on the planet Earth.
Mhm.
So I'm curious what you observe about the Salvadoran to Salvadoran relationship. Is there a sense that they recognize each other or take some pleasure in simply sharing the identity of being Salvadoran?
For sure. I think that's new, and that's why it is so, there was so much strife and so much class war. Like any developing country, the class conflicts are so highlighted always. That's always a shock to me as a foreigner, how those are much more entrenched than they would be in the United States, for example, at least on the surface, let's say. Like the performance of class is huge, huge here. But yeah, it's new, this new spirit, especially with the second election. It was incredible in February, on election day, people, going through, just the spontaneous grassroots participation and getting out the vote and auditing the election and witnessing the election and celebrating the election. Like the feeling of kindred spirit and the greater unifying other that's not an evil. They don't it's not perceived as this authoritarian. It is perceived for the most part as benevolent. Now, I want to qualify that you could critique that, but yeah, it's really, really incredible. This fellow feeling is everywhere in casual conversations, but it doesn't take away the class separations, that are maybe, more embedded. But the feeling that you're participating with a historic moment in the world is just palpable. The hope, the optimism, the sense of building. They're building a Bitcoin city. If people don't know, they're building a whole, something probably in the direction of Prospera.
I'm curious how, and I imagine they're more trusting than the people I'm used to, in a sense, relative to public information. If I hear something from the American government, I immediately disbelieve it. If I hear something from my own government, I'm skeptical. I'm interested in what Malay's doing in Argentina, but when he throws out numbers, I'm like, well, who checked that? uh, is there a sense in El Salvador that when people hear things from the news, from the government, that they generally believe it?
I would say no. There's still a lot of skepticism, and there are There are a lot of I would say that's correlated with education and globalness, global identification, degree of cosmopolitanism, how skeptical there are supporters who grudgingly go along with this regime, more in that sense, highly skeptical of the rhetoric, highly skeptical. That's a very real contingent of supporters. And I would say the diaspora that's really globally distributed, the whole generation that fled the Civil War, they are the ones who are emotionally pulled back to homeland, to that feeling, that fellow feeling, that sense of national soil. That I've probably met 100 people who have said, I never thought after 30 years I would be in this country again. I never thought I would see my family again. So that's I think, yeah, the folks that had to flee are hit the greatest supporters of Bukele. And then the upperly mobile and well-educated within the country, I think there's more rational, skeptical, reasonable criticisms. Realistic,
I
grounded in being here.
I grew up on the ocean, so one of the things I remember seeing a lot as a kid was birds circling over pieces of driftwood in the water, trying to determine whether it was something they could land on or not. So I have that sense of, like, is this floating log of a country stable enough for us to come back to?
Very much. And this country is in, I would say, something like a third wave of this boom economically. So the land and real estate values have just at least tripled, maybe more. So the Salvadorans who are returning now to buy property or take control again of family property or land, that's exactly the negotiation they've been in, but it's more like it's more like a feeling, it's exploitative, really. There's more, it's a gold rush, it's got that, a lot of, urgency and greed and loss of proportion, but it's more like a race to come back among people who see now that, like, one of the things that, again, Curtis Yarvin, has a very particular point of view. But one of the things that he said that I thought was correct was, he said it's going to take about 10 years for the Salvadoran people to realize that they can take down the razor wire. And that's kind of the mood. It's the aesthetics of the country. It's this Jurassically beautiful, rugged, gorgeous landscape juxtaposed with razor wire, barbed wire, bars everywhere you can see, the residue, the traces of war, not just the Civil War, going back in time. So that being born into that culture of it's not safe here and what that, just does to the body, the aesthetics, the relations, huge.
Yarvin belongs to this cluster of interesting, complex, seemingly leading edge conservative political thinkers in the world today. And he has a lot of support for oligarchy and autocracy and ethno-nationalism and things like that. I'm curious how you feel when some of those things seem like they're the necessary and important forward step in El Salvador, but Many of them must resemble things that you didn't like and fled from as an American. What's it like to be between those?
Yeah, I think it's um, overreach, authoritarian overreach has a different feel on the right and the left. It has a different, vibe. Um, I guess what I would say to that, yeah, it's so one thing, Salvador has taught me is that, how situational this, although we have instantaneous communication and such a global planetary awareness, these local situations really require local, you know, responses. Um, and it's exactly that. I think that's that's why I'm so over, political party politics, because we come to believe that we can map these algorithms onto anywhere, and we know that doesn't work. We know that, it's not, that formulaic approach doesn't work. And Bukele himself, this regime will not prove to be a long-term solution. It's a process. Is it, the deep contradiction of all that? Yeah, for the biopolitical is what moves me. So, in that deep sense of not just my lifestyle choices, but um, yeah, the when a regime uh, um, removes the possibility to participate is what frightens me the most. So I think I'm thinking about, yeah, it just brings me back to the state. I guess I would say no, there's no ism, no existing ism that's a solution, but I do think that, yeah, I don't accept out of hand that there's never a role for authoritarianism. It's so contextual, it's so situated. Like a pure anarchist, position is like pure voluntarism with, abolishing institutions. I don't, there's something directionally correct about recognizing that, like Buckminster Fuller said, we have to build a new platform because given where we are with the poly meta crisis, we don't have time to fix this. And that the problem where we get stuck, I think, is that, like, again, I lived in China and I witnessed how that form of authoritarianism can be very effective. But we have these narratives that come sweeping in, and it's that the thought terminating cliche or whatever it is, the way we hold the narrative prevents us from staying in that suspended place where there could be actually a breakthrough solution that would come out of it. So I, I think yeah, Yarvin has a little piece of the truth. I give him a certain amount of credit, even though um, anyone who's thoughtful and thinking, I can't reject. I have to try to absorb what of that has utility.
When I'm looking at the multifaceted, emerging and accelerating meta crisis, but also just the world conditions that look like they're emerging to dominate the planet in the next period of time.
Mhm.
Um, I think of ways we could handle that, right? I think there are definitely possibilities for some form of enhanced democracy that compiles collective intelligence in a way that exceeds our individual preferences and works with our new technologies and is agile and adaptive and creative and ecologically aware and all that's definitely possible. But in most nation states, that seems so unlikely as to be less probable than the apocalypse in the minds of
Right.
people. So instead, we're probably going to get some combination of uh, dynamism of the market directed by states that have more autocratic or at least executive control and are bound together with a resurgent quasi-traditionalist narrative to hold people
Mhm.
together. And I think we see that emerging or trying to emerge all over. But that how we get that traditional narrative is interesting because a lot of those traditional narratives famously leave a bunch of people out. And it seems like we need a shared, or one of the theories anyway, is that for the cultural field to have a shared future, it needs to have a shared sense of a past, a shared historical tale. And I'm curious about how that's viewed in El Salvador because there are privileged foreigners. There are the descendants of Hispanic European colonizers. There are the Mayan and the Olmec people and whatever vestiges of the really ancient pre-Mayan cultures that might be there. Is there a sense that these demographics and their historical epochs are brought together in a shared sensibility? Does El Salvador feel like it shares a history, or does it feel like it's kind of divided on those fronts?
I think I think it's very divided on those fronts, but that I would say that that underpins the success of the Bukele administration. He has mythically, woven that story, and that collective imaginal is absolutely what has animated this. They have a different set of historical conditions to back test and regress back into in order to go forward in that kind of, how Claire Graves would have talked about it, than in the United States, where, we had to, it's just such a painful image to think of how we had to get where, how we got where we are now. We have to get the lessons so painfully. It's almost like in the most painful possible way to rediscover the obvious that we can't have freedom for everyone and tolerance of everyone and, you know, um, real advancements without appreciating what we have, our shared history and our shared past. We are so not there yet. We can't make that move, cannot make that move to have it be okay to be American, to be patriot. I think that was what I was starting to say about Chomsky, that he, I think he recognizes that function. If we can't make that move, then we'll never get there. We'll absolutely never get there.
At this moment, at this point in your life, what percentage of you feels El Salvadoran? What percentage feels American? What percentage feels I'm just a human being on the earth?
I have always felt like, again, it's just kind of due to my own patterning. I have been a witness, I've been an outsider. I've always identified as a citizen of humanity, a citizen of the planet, traveled a lot, more than Yeah, my feeling about being American is really probably at an all-time low right now, although I wouldn't say I've assimilated here. I'm very aware of my otherness, my alterity. Um, I was starting to mention before we started recording that I have an instinct, I have an intuition that I'll be moving on. Um, I don't know when, I'm not really thinking about it in temporal terms, but the idea that it's more like it's not, it's very, very interesting to be here in a time of national prototyping. That's what excites me about being here. I'm not a Bitcoin fundamentalist. I'm interested in blockchain and Web3 innovation broadly, and that's happening everywhere. But mainly I'm looking for tribe. I do want to, my various attempts to belong have taught me a lot. And so it's more like a pull into a prototyping community is what is moving my decision. So it won't be that I'd be leaving because I don't like it here or there's something that's necessarily off. The kind of edgy what emergent quality of El Salvador, really appeals to me. But it is too, for one thing, it's too Bitcoin centric for me. I'm not, again, it's partisan. I'm not interested in the knowing of the solution. I'm interested in being in the adventure of discovering what is the recombinant, emergent, factors that we need. And I'm interested in this whole flowering of community experimentation that's going on in short term and long term intentional community and network state, and all of that is just super important. So I'm looking, I know I want to participate more directly with that. So it will be to do with finding um, the reason to stay is it's the privilege of participating in a community where we're sharing those superordinate goals and volunteerist ethos. So I'm looking for that, you know, unicorn somehow, that combination of fellowship that I haven't really found anywhere. There are things I love about China. I thought I would retire to China, but that was before the current regime. It was a long time ago when, after Deng Xiaoping's administration, it looked like, the whole world was opening up. It was a very different moment. So it's not place-based, I guess, is what I'm taking such a long time to say, but it's more of a tribal thing.
Yeah, I mean, we're all kind of walking that dialectical tension between being somewheres or anywheres, right? You can't fall wholly on any side of that. Um, if there was a liminal web passport, we'd all sign up for it. Who is our digital network, spiritual and cognitive, collaborative tribe and existential community? But at the same time, it only sort of exists. um, and then I guess, I mean, here's an interesting question for me, which is suppose you don't move on in the next couple of years, suppose you're there for 10 more years.
Mhm.
What would it take in El Salvador in those next 10 years for you to feel twice as El Salvadoran at that point as you do right now?
Mm. What really comes up instantly for me is I'm not sure if I would ever feel Salvadoran. I think that's what the strategy of exit forfeits.
Mm,
As much as I love China and I was drawn there by the Tao, by the deep time associations of China, Chinese cosmology, I could never be that, you know. There's always that difference, that profound difference. So I don't know if that would ever come to pass, but my investment and engagement with long-term community choices and endeavors, you know, the building of that barn, as you often refer to it, together with folks who share my values more than right now. I share my lifestyle with communities of practice that are more narrowly focused around health. And that's one dimension of it. But it's not what I need to feel met, to feel whole, to be seen and to see others, consistently, ongoingly inside of a commitment to work, to seriousness, to projects. That's really my dream is, um, I think there's a lot of really, apart from intentional communities and network states and that kind of level of it, there's so many interesting prototypes going on for holding containers for,
mm.
um, soul uh, evolution, soul growth, strengthening and fortifying one another, being there for each other. And I think that's what I did under the radar in the institution, because the institution provided me cover as an educator. You know, I was working more like a guidance counselor, but yeah, I think it's something to do with, oh, how do you create conditions for intergenerational um, holding and fortification of the work that's most important right now. It's urgent work. The In one way, the the simplest way I could think about the election, if we see the election as a fractal of everything of our broken world, it was a failure of cultural transfer, a failure of the, boomer generation to, empower emerging leadership. Um, yeah, so I think we need a lot of little seed pods of this. And so that healing is that intergenerational wound that I think is even kind of more formative than the national wound. I think that's what I most want to contribute to.
So whether it's El Salvador or anywhere else, you need a richer, more multidimensional, soulful, creative tribe focused on intergenerational healing. So we'll take that as a given. Um, there's another question here for me, though. Like, I'm thinking of my mother. My mother's lived for decades in Puerto Rico,
Hmm.
and she always talks about the Puerto Ricans, and sometimes she'll beat her breast to signify their kind of masculinist patriotism there. But the Puerto Ricans are very American, right? If you visit them, a lot of them are just watching TV and drinking 2 liters of diet soda and going to McDonald's. Whereas she and her husband, they grow all these plants that are native to Puerto Rico, and they've traveled to every region and they've seen all the sacred sites. They've eaten all the plants and foods that are from there. In my mind, she's in some ways more Puerto Rican than most of the quote unquote Puerto Ricans I meet down there, but she still feels she's the other.
Mhm.
And I'm curious from your point of view, what do you think it would take for you to get over your otherness and get over your exit psychology, whether it's in El Salvador or in some other hypothetical community? Is that something you can get past, or is it just always going to be characteristic of you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the work I'm trying to do. It's not that I don't want to belong. Yeah, it's kind of, yeah, it's the way that that wound has held me back and also is useful in some ways. Um, yeah, why not start anywhere, as John Cage said? Why not here? Yeah, I think that's valid. I think that that's why not just start in the Florida Panhandle where those wonderfully self-sufficient salt of the earth folks would embrace me and yeah. Yeah, I guess what comes up for me is that would be fine if it was just about me. Um, yeah, I have such a great life here. There's absolutely nothing I really, my world supports my health and vitality now. I've got that dialed in. Why not just dig in? Yeah, because of, I guess, of what time it is. I, and I know that the, there's something about, you know, we need the collective to make our next moves. Um, it's not enough for me to get my own preferences dialed in, you know, in a beautiful way. There's such greater challenges, and it's a pull for me. It's not, it's just it's the time on Earth to experiment with lifestyle. So it's more the way experimental community with all its challenges compels me. It's more like a pull into that. And I would say my yeah, it's an exit strategy combined with a desire to belong. It's both of those things. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
I think it
that's how
does. So,
I'm so comfy here in a material sense. I'm feeling good again. So now I have my energy back and I notice that I'm ready to move. I'm ready to participate in that fuller way.
so there's a quality of communion with the planetary zeitgeist and another level of service and curiosity and participation in the world moment that is uh, emotionally and ethically enticing to you, whether or not this exit thing remains characteristic of you or not. And that's something in addition to how nation states operate.
Mhm.
And that brings me to sort of, I'm curious to feel out your position on nation states in general, because when we think about what's next, what's bigger, what's meta, what's in between, what do we need, there is this sense that we're the spiritual and developmental version of the digital network society takes the world as its archetype or its reference point. And the question of how that world relates to countries is a really open-ended question. I think we've all lived through it. I think you've lived through it in a very explicit way, which is, do we participate in the planetary through the nation states, or does the planetary come at the expense of the nation state? And how do you hold the relationship between those polarities?
Yeah. I think the collapse of the modern form of the nation state, the modern form of administrating at the nation level has been collapsing so long. We're more in the middle of it, so that balance of power between global governance and national governments has been moving for a long time. Um, yeah, I think the where I see it going is more to, again, I think like a volunteer on a volunteerist basis, which is what I think will promote the most anti-fragility and resilience for everyone. It's going toward affinity zones. We're heading toward in some slower or quicker way toward affinities in place, like, the Texas secession movement. Or I was just in a course with Max Borders, and he talked about an experimental state between the US and Mexico where, membership would be based on voluntary, affiliation. I think that's the general trend that we're going to see. Um, I think we're really on the brink of some really hard times globally. So, I mean, the other thing I would add to what you asked me is to what degree now is the president or is the United States really, you know, the authority anymore? I don't know. I think that's doesn't really match the narrative, but yeah, I think it's heading toward places of affinity and more balkanization. I think that could be a good thing. It could be incredibly destabilizing and cause incredible suffering. Well, I know. Oh, and but that just brings me back to communities of practice and participation and intentionality, because only those collectives that are organized around something, some values that are more compelling, are going to, have what it takes to make it through, to survive the kind of, you know, the inevitable chaos of what's ahead.
This is a really open question for me because I think I've spent most of my life assuming a transformation beyond the nation state for good or ill. But also, there's a strong possibility that the transition isn't a 10 or 50-year thing, it's a several centuries long thing, and we're not going to see anything like that for a while. And what we are going to see is a retrenchment and a doubling down on the nation state in order to deal with the emerging turbulence. That this sort of collapse of the nation state has to be arrested at some point, and we will sort of fall in behind nations that have invested, like China. You were talking about, you would have liked Deng Xiaoping's China, but not necessarily the contemporary China. It's been pivoting hard to being a nation state power. And it may be that in a few years or already, people are saying, well, that looks like it's kind of working, and none of these other strategies are working. What we need to do is double down on nation state. And instead of being so free about allowing people to try to find their affinity groups, we'll do what our ancestors did, which is start forcing affinity on people who happen to live in a particular military, economic, and bureaucratic region. So
Mhm.
I'm torn in both directions. I don't know what it is we're going to see in the next couple of decades, whether that will look more or less like the nation state, even though long term my impulses go in one particular direction.
Yeah, I think that's very likely. Thanks for articulating that opposing position because, yeah, I think that's it's almost inevitable. It's almost like similar to the way the election went, the public, you know, outrage and outcry against authoritarianism is almost just a harbinger of the fact that it's homeopathically, that's what we're going to receive, whether we want it or not. And I think, here in El Salvador, it makes perfect sense why that clicked in because of where this country is at. But it's like you say, it's going to feel very different in the United States and Canada. It's that regression of like shoring up and coming back to something more fundamental and we probably won't like the feel of it. It'll be, an AI supercharged authoritarian regime. So that's already here in some respects.
Well, I guess we're just about at the end of this conversation. There's one more question that's sort of been on my mind a little bit, just about the visceral relationship between people and cultures, and it has to do with food. Um, I came from a family that was very international and very experimental with what it ate. And I remember the first flight I took by myself was to get to Japan, and I had to fly from Los Angeles to South Korea. Really long flight. The stewardesses only spoke Korean. I couldn't order anything, so I just ordered what this married couple beside me. The same thing as them. They brought me the food, and I'm eating the food, and I can see them looking at me, right? And so I eat the food, and they're suddenly beaming, right? Oh, I ate their food. I like their food. And now they're chatting with me, though they don't really speak English. They're buying me drinks. They had this incredible sense of welcome, and I felt not quite imposter syndrome, but I thought that can't be the test. You don't know that I'm not a serial killer. I just because I ate your food, that's a very bad membrane. And
Right.
yet that food is that important to most people in terms of how they make shared civic spirit. And with all of that nonsense in mind, what's your favorite El Salvadoran dish?
Yeah, I would say, most people would say pupusas. I don't know if you know Salvadoran food, but it's sort of like the pizza of El Salvador. It's the ubiquitous food. It's either a rice or a corn kind of bun, a flat bun that has different fillings, either veggies or with garlic or pork or fish or something like that, fillings. But my favorite food in that scenario in that meal is something called cortido, which is a pickled fermented cabbage. It's a relish for the pupusa, and it usually goes with hot sauce habanero, usually So I love, yeah, what I have come to love the most are all the different pickled vegetables down here. Yeah,
Hmm.
delicious.
Well, beautiful, Lisa. Thank you for this slice of your own impression of the world political situation, but also this you as probe into the nature of El Salvador at this moment for other people who can only trust someone who has some of the characteristics that we both share.
Thanks so much, Layman. It's been fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, lovely to see you. Be well.
Bye bye.